When we started Transcend 10 or 12 years ago, we used to only obsess about design. Everything I just said in number one. And what we found is that sometimes the design really did well and it worked as intended, and sometimes it completely failed. And it was embarrassing and it was hard. It was very hard-won lessons. And so we started to ask ourselves, what is the difference? Because it's the same design in many cases. And what we realized is that as important as design is, so are human conditions. And school is ultimately a human business.
Hello and welcome to the EdVance Podcast. I'm your host, Vikas Pota. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jeff Wetzler, co-founder of Transcend and head of Transcend Labs. Previously, Jeff spent a decade in senior leadership at Teach for America, including as Chief Learning Officer and EVP of Teacher Preparation, Support, and Development. Before that, Jeff worked at Monitor Group, an international consulting firm, where he advised executives on strategy and organizational development. Jeff was also a founding board member of Leadership Prep Charter Schools and served on the boards of Uncommon Schools, New York City, National Academy of Advanced Teacher Education, and New Classroom Innovation Partners. In 2024, Jeff authored the book, Ask, Tap into the Hidden Wisdom of People Around You. Jeff is a Pahara/Aspen Fellow and Edmund Hillary Fellow. He earned a doctorate from Teachers College, Columbia University. Jeff, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to the EdVance Podcast. Jeff, what makes a great school?
Well, a great school, in my estimation, has two things. One, amazing learning outcomes, and two, amazing learning experiences. Often these things are pitted against each other, or we only consider one. But in my view, a great school has both. Just to unpack that for a moment, learning outcomes, ultimately the product of schooling is learning. And so it comes down to what are kids actually mastering, including things like, can they read and can they do math? But also, can they think? And are they becoming curious? And can they collaborate? And are we cultivating leaders? All of that counts as the kinds of learning outcomes that I think makes for a great school. Equally important and side by side is what we at Transcend think about as experiences. This is the day-to-day felt experience, lived experience of kids at school. And we think about experiences as important for two reasons. One is there is a growing body of research that shows that experiences drive outcomes. If you're loving school, you're more likely to show up. You're more likely to work hard. You're more likely to engage. If school feels boring, you're less likely to be there or mentally be there as well. But secondly, we actually believe that kids need to be thriving not just once they graduate from school, but day to day, moment to moment in school. And so experiences count because we want to see kids doing well in the actual act of schooling. And I think far too often we have thought about, schooling is like, eat your vegetables. It wasn't fun for me. It's not going to be fun for you as well. But, if you work really hard, one day you'll be glad you did that. And we think that time is over. We need kids to be having great experiences today while they're also mastering incredible learning outcomes.
Why do you think it's not the case that that's the experience of a large number of children today?
Well, I think a large number of children in the mainstream still go to a school that is predominantly in this paradigm that we could call the factory model or the industrial model of school. That was never built to create great experiences. That was built for other things, and it was really successful for other things, like mass production of getting kids through school, like socializing kids, like getting kids to master a basic set of stuff. It was just never designed for great experiences to be part of the equation.
But how much autonomy does a school leader have in changing the learning experience, given that in most public education, it's the government or the state authority or the district authority that actually makes a decision as to what they do?
Well, it does depend on the system. Obviously, there are plenty of systems where individual schools, whether those are independent schools or charter schools or highly decentralized systems like you might see in a place in New Zealand, for example, individual schools have quite a bit of autonomy. And then in other systems, they are deeply embedded in the state. And in our experience, oftentimes there's a mix. Some design decisions live at the level of the school. Some design decisions live at the level of the district. Some decisions live at the level of country or state. And so it does vary by context.
And, your work at Transcend, do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. So Transcend is an organization I co-founded together with Elon Samoa back in 2015. And it's really dedicated to supporting schools. And we think about schools as either individual schools or systems of schools to create extraordinary learning experiences and outcomes. And the primary lens that we take on that is the design of school. And when I say design, I don't just mean the physical design of school, the architecture. I mean everything that goes into the design of learning experiences. And we think about learning experiences just the same way someone who designs a product or a service or a piece of art thinks about that. It's a series of design choices that get made. Everything from how is time used to what are the roles of adults to what is the curriculum to how are things measured to what are the cultural routines that are designed, etc. And we believe that if school was designed one way at one point in time, it can be designed a different way. And so for the last, I would say 10 or 11 years, we have been obsessing over this question of what does it look like for school communities to come together and design something better. And we have been learning about and working towards this methodology that we call community-based design, which basically means an alternative to the top-down answer, which is just impose a new answer. We wrote about it in our book. It's also an alternative to a fully grassroots answer, which says just put all the work on people who are already overburdened. We see community-based design as a third way, as a way to say, let's get the best of centralized knowledge, expertise, codified models, but also honor the agency and local wisdom of people in every single school community.
I mean, there's a suggestion. Well, more than a suggestion, actually. We talk about the relevance of schools for today's, very dynamic and fast-changing kind of future, as I think people call it. What are the shifts that schools need to make to stay relevant?
We have a series of shifts that we talk about. We call them the leaps. These are 6 shifts that we think every school needs to be considering. Particularly, I would say they've always been important, but particularly as the world is changing more quickly, particularly in the AI age, particularly as we are not sure how fast kids are going to need to reinvent themselves to stay employed, if at all, as well. So I can run you through them if that's helpful.
Please.
And I would say the first shift is a shift in terms of what is school even geared towards. And so traditionally school has been geared towards testable knowledge. And we don't disagree that testable knowledge still remains important and will always remain important, but we want to broaden the aperture. We want to say, what if we geared school towards the whole child flourishing? What if we paid attention to also mental health? What if we paid attention to well-being? What if we paid attention to relationships? What if we paid attention to social capital? All the things that we actually know truly make people flourish. And to me, this is not an either or. It's not like you either go for whole child or you go for the traditional things. So much research shows that when kids are showing up to school in their survival brain because they're carrying all kinds of home trauma or community trauma, they're not even going to learn the academics. So if we take a more whole child approach, we can actually not only do better in academics, but we can actually support broader flourishing. And that's a set of design choices that we can make. Number 2 is really a shift from isolation and conformity, where if you think about the traditional design of school, we've got kids sitting alone in desks, and we say to kids, if you collaborate with another kid on a homework, that's called cheating, as opposed to what would it mean if we actually geared school towards connection and community? Because in an age of AI, all the individual learning, that can be done individually. Kids can work with bots and tutors and all those kinds of things. The thing that is uniquely valuable for school is actually coming together as a community. And it turns out that takes a set of skills to learn how to do that. How do we navigate and negotiate differences? How do we work together? How do we create a sense of belonging, particularly when more and more schools have diverse communities as well? So that's number 2.
Before you go to number 3,
yes,
when you talk about from isolation and conformity to connection and community, as you phrase it, isn't it obvious? I mean, anyone with the right mind will say that actually, the way that you phrase it, who isolates? I mean, education is about character building and everything. Who isolates? Who really does conformity? And who doesn't want community and connection? So it's a little bit isn't it a bit obvious?
Well, I would say that, I think you could probably say the same about all 6 that I say. As I talk them through, we would all want them. But if you look at how kids spend their time day to day in schools, you would say, why would we do that? Why would we make kids sit by themselves? Why would we make kids tell kids you can't work together on assignments and different things like that? So I might tweak to what you said and say it should be obvious. And I don't think it's the case that individual educators or school leaders are somehow making the obviously wrong decision. My perspective is that they're trapped in this model. And it's the model that dictates the fact that we're making these choices that I think are counterintuitive as to what, not only what kind of common sense would say is important, but what the research says is important as well.
Well, let's crack on with your list.
Okay, great. The third one is all about rigor. And so, the traditional model of school would say, let's make sure kids can read. Let's make sure they can write. Let's make sure that they memorize certain facts. Let's make sure that they know, this system in biology and this period of time in history and all those kinds of things. And that matters. But that is the easiest stuff for AI to just replicate. And so if that's where we set our goals, if that's where we say success is we've achieved this literacy and numeracy and whatever, we have set the bar way too low because all of that is going to be so easily replaceable, as opposed to things like creativity, original thinking, synthesis, generating counter arguments, simulating an audience, designing things. Now, we could still say maybe AI will get to that at some point in time, but this is the more uniquely human stuff as well. And so it's a matter of what are we setting our sights on? What counts as success? What are the methods and modes of pedagogy that we're considering acceptable as well? Fourth one is all about relevance. There is just, we have done research with tens of thousands of students who are increasingly saying to us, school is just boring. Why do I need to learn this? Especially these days when everything else in my life is hyper relevant to me. The music that I listen to is hyper relevant to me. Where I shop, how I get, and if we're saying to kids, you just need to learn this, and if it's boring, forget it, doesn't matter, you'll need it someday. That just less and less holds water. And so this is a shift from irrelevance to hyper-relevance. How do we help kids to say, you're not doing this just in case you need it or because you'll need it sometime, but because this is like so personally important to you right now? There's just to give you one example, and I can give examples for all of these, but there's a school that I walked into called New View, which is now all around the world. And it is a school where kids are literally solving real world problems through making and through engineering things. And anytime I go into a school, I say, I try to speak to kids and I say, what are you working on? What are you learning and why? This place, they would not talk to me. They were so absorbed in what they were doing that they didn't want to waste a minute talking to somebody who wasn't going to actually help them advance the problem that they were trying to solve. To me, that's a sign of hyper-relevance. When kids are just saying, this matters so much to me. And I think, and I talk to people all around the world who are saying that kids are voting with their feet. If it's not feeling relevant, they will find other things to do, whether inside their brain while in school or just by not showing up to school as well. The fifth one is really a shift from a one-size-fits-all kind of thing where like the kids have to fit into the system. If you're this age, you're going to this grade for this amount of time, and you're going to move to, next year you're going to do this, whether whether you've mastered it or nearly mastered it or basically didn't master it. And the way that you learn is going to be the same for all 30 or 50 or 100 of you in the classroom, to a mode of customization where we're basically saying the system has to fit the kid as opposed to the kid has to fit into whatever the system is. And that has to do with the pace of learning, the mode of learning, the path of learning, all of these different things. There's no reason why in this world where, everything else is completely personalized, we can't begin to personalize and customize what's going on for kids as well. And then the last one, to me, this is the most important one. This is actually my favorite one, is a shift from passive compliance to active self-direction or agency. If you were to track a kid in school, and I would say in a mainstream school, the vast majority of kids, and you just track the number of choices that they actually have about how they spend their time, where they sit their body, how their body has to sit, what they're talking about. It's a shockingly low amount of choices that kids actually have. And so they're given the message, your job is to basically follow directions and comply. And maybe in an economy where we had lots of jobs where kids needed to graduate to be able and learn how to do that was okay. But we're now heading into a world, I think, where every few years, if not more frequently, the world is going to change and kids are going to have to reinvent themselves. and to just keep up and stay relevant, that means they're going to need to drive their own learning. And that means that in school, they need to practice driving their own learning, which means that they need to be directing themselves. And that means they're not always going to make the right answer, the best answers. They're going to make mistakes. But part of this shift is, how do we help kids make choices, reflect on those choices, learn how to make better choices next time? And this is, to me, one of the scariest ones for a lot of educators, because they say, what happens if we give kids autonomy to make choices and they make terrible choices? And we have worked with schools that have tried to do this, and they've ripped the Band-Aid off way too soon. And what we find is, basically, for about a third of the kids, they actually do pretty well in this. And a third of the kids, it's complete chaos. And then there's a third in the middle. But the kids who are causing chaos basically mess it up for everybody else. And so then it leads to schools to pull back and say, we're just going to tell you what to do. There's one school that we have had the privilege to work with called Redbridge Academy, that has tackled this problem in a brilliant way, which is, they basically said, instead of grouping kids exclusively by age, which is the traditional way, or by mastery level, which is the more progressive way, we're going to group them by readiness for autonomy. And so as kids demonstrate that they can make better choices and direct their learning, they get more and more freedom. And so it taps into the natural human motivation, I think, for freedom and liberation. But it says, you earn that autonomy. And when you show us you're ready for it, great. We want you to have more, and we want you to have more. But it avoids this kind of chaos that happens if you just rip the Band-Aid off too quickly.
Jeff, you live in America, so you'll be familiar with the case that I'm going to reference here. What can we learn from Alpha School? And for our listeners, if you tell them a little bit more about Alpha School.
There's been a lot of conversation about Alpha School. It is a school network that started in Austin, now has schools across the country, typically micro schools. They are known for a couple of things. One is that they're known for trying to compress the academic learning down to a couple of hours, using tech-based tools to help do that. They're also known for intensely focusing on students' motivation. And so they have this equation of 90% of the game is motivation, 10% of the game is instruction, or whatever else. And then they're also known for using the afternoon for kids to pursue more real world learning, more passion-based learning, whether things like starting a business, or tackling a scientific problem, or learning to give a TED talk or pitch investors, or any number of different things. There's a lot of controversy and debate and discussion about Alpha in the United States right now.
But what's the controversy?
Well, I think the controversy is how much of the tech is real. How much of is AI really being helpful? How much of it is really just the fact that it costs $65,000 a kid, and anybody can get good results for $65,000 a kid, with a very low ratio. Is this applicable to anybody other than rich kids who are already at advantage? Those are some of the questions that are floating in the air. Does the motivational tactics that cause that are pushing kids to get all the academics done in 2 hours, does that stress out certain kids and actually undermine mental health? Does it take away from the love of learning if we're just saying, let's just get the academics over with in 2 hours? What does that say about a relationship to actual learning? So those are some of the controversial questions. Putting all that aside, I think what is really important about their contribution to the conversation is a couple things. One is, I think that generally in education, we have underattended to motivation. And they are putting a whole bunch of bets on motivation, including things like to say, maybe there is a place for extrinsic motivation to a point. What happens if they have these things called alpha bucks? What happens if we actually allow kids to use some extrinsic motivation to get to the point where they realize, I can actually do this thing because I put in the work? Maybe they'll become intrinsically motivated after that. So I think that's one thing that's really interesting. I think too, just questioning, why does it have to take all day long to do certain learning? What would happen if we could actually compress it? And how can tech help us to do that? And so I think that's the second thing. And I think the third thing is all of the stuff that they do after lunch, the real world skills and all those kinds of things. That is really powerful learning. Kids love that stuff. And I think that's the kind of thing that more and more schools should be doing, that should set kids up, that can set kids up for the real world as well. So that's my hot take on Alpha.
No, thank you so much for sharing that and giving the summary and your opinion. This podcast really focuses on how we drive high performance in schools. And so whilst you speak about the 6 shifts that schools need to make, what are your top 3 lessons to get high performance in schools? If you wouldn't mind just going through each one of those, and just making sure that our listeners can engage with these 3 topics or these 3 points that you will outline for everyone.
Absolutely. And I would say, I think the first thing to say is, well, the first one I'll say is school has, whether we know it or not, whether we choose it or not, a design. And most schools operate implicitly having inherited some version of the industrial model of school. And so when we think about driving performance in schools, if you don't take the design into account, what you're basically saying is, how do I squeeze the most efficiency or juice out of what I would call an outdated design of school? And so the first lesson I would say is we actually have to take the design question out of the background and put it into the foreground, and say, how do we take all that is now known about cognition and motivation and identity development and individual variability and all that we know about design thinking, and put that into the foreground and design a modern, updated version of school that we can then, squeeze all the productivity out of as possible, but don't leave design in the background, put design in the foreground. So that would be number one. The second thing is, when we started Transcend 10 or 12 years ago, we used to only obsess about design. Everything I just said in number one. And what we found is that sometimes the design really did well and it worked as intended, and sometimes it completely failed, and it was embarrassing and it was hard. It was very hard-won lessons, and so we started to ask ourselves, what is the difference? Because it's the same design in many cases, and what we realized is that as important as design is, so are human conditions. And school is ultimately a human business, and so we have developed a pretty rigorous way of looking at even measuring the human conditions in a school. So how clear are people about what's going on? That's a condition. How much conviction do they have about what we're trying to do? What's the strength of the coalition between students and parents and educators and community members? That's another condition. What's the capacity of the system? What's the culture of the system? So we have these 5 conditions that we look at, that we rigorously measure. And what we basically have concluded is that schools can progress at the speed of their conditions. So anyone can do this work, but we have to start by measuring your conditions and knowing what they are, and then meet you where you are to be able to move forward from there. That's the second lesson. The third is all about the role of leadership. And this will, I'm sure many people have reached a conclusion like this, but what we have consistently seen is that leaders are not going to be the ones who are typically teaching the classes. They're not going to be even the ones designing the curriculum. Leaders, in our view, have a single job, which is to nurture the conditions. And so the leaders that are most successful are the ones that are actually creating that clarity, developing that conviction, building a strength of coalition in a system. And the ones who are most successful do it from a posture that we call learner-centered leadership. Learner-centered leadership is different than system-centered leadership. Most leaders have grown up in a paradigm of system-centered leadership, which is, I've got to run the system. I've got to meet my budget. I've got to keep things steady and not cause any waves. I've got to fit inside this broader bureaucracy. The leaders who are getting the best performance say, to hell with that. I'm focusing on the learner. Every single day, the thing that is driving every decision I'm going to filter through what is best for every single learner. And that's a fundamentally different way of operating. And when those leaders who are learner-centered operate, they are starting to create the conditions for the kind of extraordinary experiences and outcomes to be able to be designed for and ultimately implemented.
Jeff, one of the most vexed subjects in education, in my opinion, is, all to do with one word. And, people bandy this word about so much, and it is innovation. In our World's Best School Prizes, we even have a category for innovation. It's interesting to see when schools apply for that category, what they consider to be innovation. And so, you've worked and observed many learning environments. What is the one thing the very best schools do consistently that others often overlook?
I can answer that at many levels, from what are their practices to what is their culture. Sure. To what is their, if I were to boil it down to one thing, it builds on what I was just saying, which is learner-centeredness. The very best schools in every single aspect of the school is putting the learner at the center. Even the person who's serving lunch is saying, how am I nourishing these kids, but also what's the educational environment I'm creating here? The person who's cutting the grass, the person who's obviously the teacher, they're just together unified in saying, we got to do what's best for the kid. And when you do that, then coming back to what you said, Vikas, at the very beginning, all these things that should be obvious, like we should actually build connection. We should have more rigorous learning. We should make school relevant. All of that stuff becomes, of course we would do that if we're actually listening to our learners and doing what's best for them. So I would say that is the single biggest distinguisher, is putting the learner at the center.
Yeah, I mean, again, motherhood and apple pie, like, to some degree, where you're in a school, you're in the service of your learners, and I'd be surprised if schools are not learner-centered. Why do you think it doesn't happen?
I think it doesn't happen because they're trapped inside this design that doesn't allow them to do what's best for learners. I'll just give you one very specific example. Let's say that you are a teacher and you are teaching a class, let's just say 50 kids. And in that class of 50 kids, there are some kids that are 7 grade levels below where you're teaching, and there's some that are 5 grade levels above where you're teaching. And there's some that are really motivated by engineering, and there's some that are really motivated by psychology, whatever it is. You're stuck. You got that hour, and all you can do, the hardest thing for teachers is to differentiate instruction. And yet you're basically being told, do the best thing. And so even if motherhood and apple pie want to put learners at the center, you're operating inside of a design that does not allow you to do that. And so that's why we take design as the lens, because so often design traps people from actually doing the thing that would truly be what's best for every learner.
I want to get a little bit practical here. Just before our interview today, I was speaking to a fantastic leader in Mexico, actually, who I will introduce you to separately. And she asked me a really great question regarding, I want to build a school. How do I make it the world's best, right? And I think the corollary to this, to some degree, is she was asking, what is the one bold or unconventional idea you have seen a school implement that genuinely improves student outcomes?
I'm going to give myself two things to say. One is comes back to what I was saying earlier about active self-direction. Because if you can flip it from we are rowing you across the river to this other destination and you're sitting in the boat with us, to you're actually not only rowing the boat, but you're deciding where the boat goes, then all of a sudden you harness all of the energy and brilliance and motivation that exists often untapped inside of kids. And so this flip from compliance to active self-direction is number one. But that is in some ways I'd call that like a me flip, like, me as the kid I know to be in charge. But there's also the we component. If we just build kids who are actively self-directed for themselves, that's not good enough. And so the second thing I would say is truly nurturing the sense of community, and we're all in it together. I'll just give you one, incredible example of a school that's doing that. That's called Valor Collegiate. But as a side note, and I don't think it's coincidental, get the very top level academic results. Not just in terms of overall performance, but also in terms of closing and even reversing all equity gaps in terms of different subgroups. But a huge piece of what they do is invest in the sense of community, to the point where they literally design into their day significant portions of time where students actually get together and go through this curriculum where they have to invest in their relationships with one another, with sharing, here's what's challenging for me, here's what's hard, here's a piece of feedback, here's my values, the kinds of things that society would be better if every adult knew how to do. And when they graduate this group of students, which is by the way, an incredibly diverse group of students are not only incredibly academically prepared, but they now are living and practicing the kind of community that I think we need in every part of society. So active self-direction and true community would be the two things they would be the two bets I would personally make. How does that compare to your answer when she asked you the question?
We've done about 25 of these interviews to talk to people like yourselves from around the world, to understand how they view high performance. And there's one really overriding message that comes through for me from all these 25 interviews. Now, I must tell you, I'm not a teacher. I've never been an educator. I've never worked in a school. And so I limit myself to being an observer in that sense. And my comments and my experience tells me that actually, I was listening to a podcast that will go live next week with Dr. Stefan Sommer from MISC School in Saudi Arabia. And he was really interesting, where he talked about his job as the principal of this very famous school is quite simply to put opportunity in front of his students. And what happens is that in many systems, including my own over here in England, sometimes I feel that there's a psychosis, like, saying that we can't do anything new, we can't do anything additional, we can't do anything that actually may interest our kids. And it's just one of those really interesting points that I think that when I ask you the question, what is the one bold, unconventional idea that we have seen schools implement that genuinely improves student outcomes? It goes back to your point about being student-centric.
Yes.
And I
Exactly.
think that is the game changer in many ways.
And as you say, it's easy to say that.
Yeah.
It's easy to espouse that we do that. But
Yeah.
if we actually look at the day-to-day experience of students, it's often not that way.
Yeah, again, one of the things that we've done through the World's Best School Prizes is that we've learned that the commonality between all the schools that do well lies in the area of positive school culture. And that's why we created Best School to Work as a subscription mechanism that schools could actually use to assess and then improve culture, because that is the lever for high performance. I firmly believe that. Now, when we talk about all the things that you've talked about, they very much strike to the same kind of messaging and substantive points that we make. But I want to end this interview with one question, because again, keep it very practical for those people that are listening, which is, what is the one question every school principal should ask their staff this week to uncover what is really holding their school back?
I would say, have you sat down with every single kid and had a deep conversation with them about their actual experience under your care? And I say that because in our experience, and this is where we start every design project, we started by listening to kids. And I cannot tell you the number of educators who have been in the field for 20 or 25 years. And we say to them, start by just sitting down for 45 minutes with a kid. And we can give you the questions so you don't have to run out of things to talk about, and deeply understand their experience and what they wish was true and what their ideas are. And after they do that, these educators who are veteran educators say, I've never done that before. And I cannot unhear what they just told me. How bored they feel, how isolated they feel, how marginalized, how scared they actually feel. But I also can't unhear the freaking brilliant ideas that they have for what could be better. And so if I could bring myself down to one thing, to your question, it would be, have you actually listened to the kids?
Jeff, thank you so much for taking part in this podcast. I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of the EdVance Podcast with Jeff Wetzler, co-founder of Transcend and head of Transcend Labs. We discussed, in summary, we discussed what enables high performance in schools, and how leaders can shape the conditions for it. My 3 takeaways from what Jeff has talked about is, firstly, that intentional design matters. Learning experiences are designed either deliberately or by default. Leaders can redesign them to match how people learn and what students need now. The second point that Jeff made was around human conditions matter. He shared 5 essentials: clarity, conviction, coalition, capacity, and culture. And these are the foundations that make high performance possible. The third and very interesting and important lesson is that leadership is about creating the conditions for others to succeed. It is not only managing systems, but building an environment where people can do strong work consistently. If you found this episode useful, please subscribe, share it with a colleague, and follow the podcast for future episodes. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Jeff, for taking part.
It's been great talking with you.